a lot of material, so I want to use it in some other ways. So there was a survey part, and there's your numbers. So this is the age group we're talking about, 9 to 16. And there was a qualitative part, which involved interviewing children of same age group, but interviewing the 9 to 10-year-olds, then the slightly older groups, 14 to 16-year-olds, and separately. But also interviewing their parents, teachers, and youth workers. So this is a mixture of interviews with individual children and usually focus groups with the children or the adults. So to get a number of a range of perspectives on these things. So I'm going to discuss 3 things today. The first, if you like, the limits on children's use of smartphones. I'm going to discuss the social constraints side. I'm going to try and get a picture of what does adoption mean. Specifically, I'm going to look at communication issues. And this was in part, we had quite a lot of material on this. Some of the other things to do with other uses of smartphones, I decided in the end we didn't have quite enough presentation, but this raises some interesting issues. And the third thing I'm going to talk about is the privatisation of the internet, and it raises issues for parental mediation. So those are the 3 blocks. Right. Quite often you get claims that we have a new generation of children who somehow have greater knowledge of ICTs or the internet or so on than their parents. I've been doing research a long time, and the first time I saw this was in relation to the VCR, when people were saying, oh, the children can work the VCR when the parents couldn't. That's the first time I noticed it. So we're going back to the late 1970s, early 1980s. It wasn't a big thing, but I do remember seeing it then. And then I did research on early home computers. And again, it wasn't a major discussion, but it came up eventually. Oh, the children know how to operate computers in the 1980s. So think how old they are now. Was that a new generation of children? Because the big one where you start to get claims about this generation is different is in relation to the internet. Especially the Prensky one I see is quoted probably the most often, talking about a generation who'd grown up with the internet compared to their parents who came along to it later on. And there's various criticisms of this, but it's a concept I want to think about. Because in principle, you can ask this again and again. I can ask this now, do smartphones make a difference? Does a generation who were young when they had smartphones going online with mobile access make a difference to their experience? But I said you could ask this question again and again. For instance, last year I was with my colleagues at a meeting, and it was this discussion of very young children and how important tablets were. And the start of some claims like, oh, this is changing the foundation of how they search and their first experience of the internet. Implicit, is that generation going to be a little bit different because of tablets? Now, in a few months I start a research project on that, so I may be back in a few years' time. I've already got one of my research questions in mind. 10 years from now, it could be something else. So this is a matter of principle we're looking at. And of course you say, well, if I wanted to address that, what would the research project look like? I'd have to ask, say, what are the relative skills of the children versus the adults, if the children are supposed to be better. But never mind about, maybe it's different skills they have. They're doing one thing, adults doing something different, which we know is true. So what's happening here? Some years ago, I remember it was quite funny. There was a lecturer in Hong Kong who wrote a piece for me, and he was really complaining about his generation of students. He says they think they can do this and that, but they can't put a PowerPoint together. So that was the skills that he was valuing. They obviously were valuing other skills that they were better at than him. But of course, then you would say, if I want to investigate it, what is a younger generation doing new? What new activities, not new practices? And you can have new but not so interesting, suppose they're better gamers. Well, is that empowering in any sense? What is it exactly they're doing, and why do you think it gives them some advantage, let's say? But to that list of those type of questions, I particularly wanted to add one more item. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. And that is, how constrained, for various reasons, are children in what they do with these technologies. And I can ask that in future about future technologies as well. Okay, let's narrow it down a little bit more. I'm going to put some layers of context on here. For a long time, you've had arguments that ICTs, one of their properties which makes them, which changes things, is you're enabled to do things anytime, anywhere. Now those words, the meaning of them has changed a little over the years. The words have been around for a long time. I've been setting essays on this for a long, long time. But at the time, anytime, anywhere was, anytime you can access a PC, you can do all these things. So you could do your shopping when the shops are closed. So it wasn't anytime, absolutely anytime, but when it's available, or yes, you can do it anywhere where you happen to have access to a PC. That's what anytime, anywhere meant at that point. And why it's important, it promised flexibility, especially time shifting when you did things, conveniences, but it also opened the way for new questions. If you can do these things in different spaces and at different times, do you do things differently? Does it lead to new practices? Or I think the equally interesting question, do you do what you used to do before, but more? This is going to be relevant to a discussion of communication. Is it really new communication, or is it more communication? To add even another layer of context on these claims like anytime, anywhere, they're often part of what I call arguments about possibilities. The argument that goes, well, whatever word you want to put in the internet, but I could have put these other things in, radio, visitex, interactive cable. Now anyone can do this, and they can do that, and they can do the other. And I tell my students constantly, if you write an essay that's totally like that, I'm going to mark you down. So I'm not keen on these arguments of possibilities. For instance, a lot of things that, yes, you can do this with the internet, were said originally about videotex in the 1970s and interactive cable in the 1980s, and they were not successful, even though they offered some of the same functionality as the internet now. Possible, but it wasn't taken up. And to go back even further, it's interesting that some of the claims about the world has shrunk and now you can talk to people right around the world was being said in about 1915, 1920 at the time. So, you read this stuff and said, they say that about the internet now. How old is that? So these are the arguments about possibilities, and this anytime, anywhere falls into those. The only thing I would say about that, I find I'm willing to listen to it a little bit, is does knowing you have possibilities lead to more ontological security? Term made famous by Anthony Giddens, but used as well in our department by Roger Silverstone. Do you have a fundamental fearing of security and safety? Roger Silverstone used to argue that television helped to provide that because it was always there, always in the background. You could rely on it being there. And some things were said about this in the mobile phone literature. When mobile phones appeared and people were buying them and not using them, when it was the emergency mobile phone, it was the knowledge that I could use it, even though in practice most people didn't. And later on, this became the security that knowing that my friends are only, a call away, a text away. And there's a whole language to describe that feeling of you feel they're closer because of that. So that's the early point where I think the argument about possibilities becomes a bit more interesting. So what happens when you apply anytime, anywhere to the smartphones? The argument is these devices, what they do new is they give mobile internet access, even if you don't know it. And I say that because when the children look up something on their apps, they don't necessarily think of it as being the internet. But the new argument is, you're not tied to the and then you get this language appearing always at hand. So, my question is the experience of the smartphone generation of children different? Mainly, I want to talk about social constraints, but then I want to add a little bit more to put the smartphone into perspective by asking about its main role and how does it relate to other ICTs? That's the small bit. Now, I come from a background where we have a framework that's called domestication that is used a lot to look at how technologies enter in our lives, how we fit them in, how they find a place in time structures, space and so on. And that tradition, I think, is very good for making you think about social constraints as well. It does it more than some other frameworks. You have to think about when people say, that's tricky, I can't do this, or I have to do it like that, or I have to fit it in there and it's a bit of a challenge, all those type of things. As an interesting study, because although there have been studies of families before which had children, here was a chance to really focus on the children. And I would argue that in many respects, if adults face social constraints in what they do, children face more, both because of their financial dependence, less cash. There's some time and space issues which I'm going to go into. And in the background, there's all these concerns about children, the risks they might face, which are not there in the same way as for adults. So there's another layer of consideration which constrains what they do. Let's think of financial ones. You know, I think smartphones are probably the most expensive things children carry around with them on a regular basis now. And that's going to have ramifications. In fact, the thing people worry a lot about is having it stolen, breaking it, losing it, because it's such an expensive item. It's up there amongst the top risks, never mind the online ones, because it's so dear. But it has implications, for instance, on what children choose to download to their apps. A lot of the time, a limited amount of money. If it's exceptional, they'll ask their parents. Sometimes if they have some source of their own from presents, they buy things. But a lot of the time, they're downloading free stuff because of that limit. So that's a constraint on what they do. But there are also constraints in the running costs. For instance, if your package says you can't go above a certain amount of data downloaded, this becomes a consideration. This becomes, oh, wait a minute, I can't look at YouTube when I'm out in the car because I'll reach my limit very quickly. So I'll watch that when I'm at home when the Wi-Fi is free. So rationing certain uses, seeking out free Wi-Fi where you can find it, looking for the free options. Yes, I could pay for this, but can I think of a way to download an app which does the same thing, which is free? And you think, when you see this again and again, you're struck by, they're more financially constrained than not all adults, but many adults would be. And that's influencing a whole set of choices. Don't know what's happened there. Okay. Works okay on my one, but I'm working with a Mac. Maybe that makes a difference. Yeah. One thing about parents' concerns is screen time in general. And the new devices have fallen into this. So it used to be worried about television time, but screen time can be watching the internet, screen time can be playing games, and screen time, can be when you're using smartphones. So one of the worries about that parents have is too much screen time, taking up too much of your life. Never mind about the eye strain issues, which they do raise. It's you're doing that rather than other things. So you've got the balance wrong in life. You should be out socialising, meeting face to face, doing sports, doing homework, whatever. Worries about it making you actually antisocial, socialist issues, which means that they often pose some constraints on children's use, more so the young children, but even sometimes the older children about no using things after bedtime. Or we've got families who say you have to hand in your smartphone when you go up, or you can't use it until you've finished your homework. These type of constraints. And also you can't use it at certain times, like having the meal together is the time when we should sit round and chat. We don't want you sitting there being on your mobile or your smartphone at that time, or texting or looking up the internet, Facebook or whatever. Or special times. Some of the interviewers saying, they didn't want me to use it when we were on holiday because it was a family time. Or when my relatives came round, you know, I shouldn't be doing it, I should be talking to them. Or as we see, even parties. So there's a whole set of time constraints imposed by parents, but there's a whole set of time constraints that children have as well. And I was interviewing one boy about his use of smartphones and says, well, you know, I'm involved in a lot of sports after school. That's my priority. So there isn't much time for using the phone. I only use it now and again. I mean, sometimes because I go to these sporting events, I even leave it behind because, you know, there's no place to put it. It might get stolen. Or other commitments such as socialising. And children will talk about smartphones as a distraction as well, not just their parents. So, you know, you're trying to do your homework and it's going beep, beep, beep all the time. So all these notifications keep arising for all these groups I'm in. And, you know, sometimes I have to go and put it in the other room. Or sometimes saying, you know, it's just too tempting for me to sit there and I'm curious to find what they've put up on Facebook recently, so I'll go and have a look at it. And then I realise that I wanted to do other things, let alone homework, and it's not getting done. Or some saying, I had such an experience like that with Facebook, I daren't go on Twitter or any other things because I've already seen how much time it's taken up. So being aware that they're tempted. And of course, peer pressures, you know, children complaining about their friends coming out and they're going out with them and they're sitting on the phone talking to somebody else. And you say, well, why did you bother to come out with me in the first place if you're going to do that? Or from the child's point of view saying, oh, well, I wouldn't do that. There's a certain etiquette that, you know, you wouldn't use the smartphones when you've gone out for a special event. Space constraints, well, they're banned in some institutions, especially I found out junior schools or for some of the younger years in secondary schools, or at certain times, perhaps understandably in lessons, or for certain purposes I should put here, like you're allowed to, I don't know, make calls and listen to music, but you're not allowed to take pictures. There's one school rule where they're starting to differentiate it. So this whole, you know, you could say it's a time issue as well, but I'll put it under space constraints, places where you can't use it. And interestingly enough, also, teachers especially, but sometimes, you know, parents advising you better not bring it out when you're on your way home from school because someone might steal it. And in a sense, they're right, because one of the schools I went to said, you know, they had a whole set of thefts a few weeks ago of younger children being intercepted on the way home by older children having their phones taken. So yes, either use it when you're at school before you set off and then put it away, and don't use it on a bus or other such places. And, you know, the children, I would say on the whole, heeded this. They knew they could lose it. So a lot of them were very careful. And as with the mobile phone before it, same with smartphones, there are certain places where it'd be really embarrassing if it went off. So another spatial constraint, but that's true for adults as well. So my main point is I hesitate about children can use smartphones anytime, anywhere, and I hesitate to say they're always at hand, especially for younger children, but even older children have some limitations placed on them. And some of these social constraints, they're the same ones as for adults. You know, you don't want to go up in a church service or a funeral or something like that, but some are more particular to children. Especially the worries about the phones being stolen and the worries about screen time, and some are more particular to younger children. Okay, as a result, the main place, interestingly, where smartphones are used from the survey is actually in the home, and it's not out and about. If you think of it as a descendant of the mobile phone, you think of it being used when you are mobile. But this is not the case for all these reasons I've described. I'll just go ahead so you can see the overall picture. About this is when out and about, so it is used then, but there's the much higher figures for in the home. Going back, so if I want to characterise the mobile phone, and I agree with my colleagues on this one, I would say it's more of a personal device and more of a personal phone than a mobile one. Now, how does it relate to other devices? Well, in our own statistics, and ones I've seen, PC use has declined somewhat. Recent ones I saw, even laptop use has declined. But you know, that doesn't mean you give up on the things that are already there. Children will say, I don't want to do my homework on a smartphone. I want a keyboard I can work at, not something like this, and I want a big screen to see what I'm doing. Or, I really don't want to play some of these games on the smartphones. It's useful when I'm out and there's no other way, but if I've got the choice, I'd like to have the faster processing power of another device, a dedicated games machine or even a PC. Or if I'm watching YouTube, I don't want to be looking at a little screen like this. Okay, if there's nothing else and I'm out, fine. But, you know, I would choose looking at a tablet or a PC or a laptop or whatever. So these other devices have their place, or the term you might use in English is they're horses for courses. They're good at some things, and so you use them, and you use the smartphone for certain other things. And sometimes they're used sequentially, as in I'll download the thing on the PC because it's a lot quicker and then transfer it to the smartphone, or I've taken loads of pictures on my smartphone but it's taking up all the space, so I'll keep the really nice ones and put the rest of them on the PC. They're used in conjunction, used sequentially. Using conjunction, I may be using two things together. Some boy had a very clever system his father had set up. He obviously didn't have a smart TV, but he was getting Netflix onto the smartphone and then projecting it onto the TV. Not sure I managed that, but I was quite impressed. And sometimes they're used contingently. You know, I would use that device, but if someone else is on it or the batteries run out, then I'll use this device. So, in other words, the arrival of the smartphone and tablet having used these terms remediated the other technologies. For instance, that's the picture I now of what the post-desktop media ecology looks like. It's using a lot of things, maybe using this, smartphones more, but using them amongst other things. That's to put it in perspective. Oh dear. This PC really doesn't like this PowerPoint. Okay. Smartphones, I'm now going to talk about communication changes. And one of the things that smartphones have done that the children talked about is they've provided more channels, because you now have like the WhatsApp or the Instagram or the whatever. They provided free channels. I mean, you used to get packages where texting almost seemed to be free. You had so many texts you could use, but now they say this is even freer. And there has facilities to broadcast more rather than one-to-one. So in the qualitative data, a number of children, especially the older ones, I must say, or even from 11 onwards, but not necessarily the very young ones, were talking about the fact that they thought they communicated more one way or another since having their smartphones. It's always a tricky one, that, because they're getting older and so they're communicating more at the same time as they're getting a device, and you're trying to sort out what's happening here. But I'm willing to believe them from their detailed descriptions that they are communicating a lot. Some thought they're certainly getting more incoming communications. You should see, if I join a few groups, you should see the amount of notifications I get. So in general, they're having more, let's say, mediated communication. Now, how do they feel about this? I must say, I would say generally positive. Some thought they'd become more sociable or more connected, or were in more perpetual contact, which is a word that comes out of the mobile phone literature. They felt positive about, you know, now it's easier. There's so many different ways to reach peers. They thought they were better informed sometimes. It was to hang out electronically to see what was going on. Not to say all these things are totally new, but they thought smartphones were helping them to do more. And the fact that there's always someone to talk to. So familiar themes, but off. So here's Andrea talking. Oh. Maybe I should look at my own PC. Here's Andrea talking. We write an iMessage on Facebook, and in class Instagram we send sometimes pictures of each other, things like that. So I can't read this, can I?
We keep in touch on Facebook, and in class on Instagram we send sometimes.
Yeah. Okay, anyway, she's going for what she's emphasising the fact that they're doing all these things before, and that's why she's arguing there's more communication. Or Valerie from Italy. What changed thanks to social networking sites and new ways of communicating, because this is in the context of talking about smartphones, is that, for example, every time I log into Facebook from a smartphone, I know I can find someone to talk to. Or if I need anything, I know there's someone there that I can take as a point of reference, have fun with. Or another Italian example, it's changed for me a lot because we didn't keep in touch once back home when we didn't have a smartphone. And it's much better now, it strengthens relationships. I used to feel lonely before because everyone else had a smartphone and they kept in touch. They had Facebook and I didn't. So different language, different words, underlying same theme. On the other hand, they will say this incoming call really generates a lot of noise. It generates a lot of things which I find, I've mentioned disruptive, but so many communications, is it really necessary? And sometimes are they trivial? Do I want to know what they had for breakfast this morning? Is that, interesting things? So there's quite a lot of discussion of that, even though sometimes they admit they send messages like that sometimes, but they resent other people sending messages that they feel that they're obliged to read. And also feeling the pressure to be available to peers. I must keep monitoring this because they will expect me to reply for certain types of communication. I can't ignore it all, even though it takes me ages to work my way through some of this stuff. And this pressure to keep, informed. We'll see that in a moment, but, if I don't monitor this stuff, I won't know what's going on. Another negative I've already mentioned, it can be too tempting, right? And too time consuming. So sometimes children talked about the fact that they did all this, but when they sat down and thought about it, that was wasting, that's their words, that was wasting my time, I thought. I still felt I had to do it, but it was taking time away from other things. So let's see some examples. There's much more communication now because SMS had certain costs, so you sent one without writing 2,000 things. Instead, now one writes thousands of messages with thousands of emoticons, thousands of nonsense, really useless things, thousands of exclamation marks, and stuff. Noise. And when you go online, you find a lot of messages that might be interesting, but you don't bother to read them all, and the next day in class they talk and you don't know what they're talking about. I feel obliged to read them all. Children are not the only one who are worried about this communication. With parents, as I said, worried about screen time. Well, screen time could include communication time as well. A sense of mediated communication isn't so good as face-to-face. I'd rather you doing face-to-face. We'll see an example in a moment. And I've already mentioned concerns that this communication is taking time away from family time. I should point out these reflect older concerns here. There's big, long-term discussions last 20 years about the quality of mediated communication versus face-to-face. It's not a new idea. Neither is online time making children less sociable. So here's Alan talking. We didn't ask the exact age, he's 14 to 16. Well, it got to the point when my parents were complaining because I was always on my phone. And so as I got older, I realised I was spending a bit too much time on it, because when we were having dinner, I would be on the phone, and that's not sociable at all, he admits. So the complaints were, we're going to take it away from you, etc. And so now at dinner, I just leave my phone in my room and talk to my parents. But it's mainly because it makes them, I guess it makes them happier, and I don't know, I guess it makes me happier as well, because I'm not always on my phone. But I think the first concern is it keeps the parents quiet, And here's Annette. Talking about children. She's a mother, I think, I forget which country, I'll see it in a moment, I think it's Germany. They were talking to each other less and less, even when they meet each other. Last year, I experienced this. A friend of my daughter, Lucas's twin sister, she invited her for her birthday, and I went there too. and there were somehow 4 or 5 girls, and they were entering the room of the birthday girl. And these 5 girls are sitting there, and each of them is typing on her mobile phone. Actually, they were mightily amused. They're sending some things to each other, they're writing to each other, even though they're sitting in the same room. Well, I don't really understand this. And I think, when there are visitors at our place, I don't want to have it that way. A way of putting, I don't like this mediated communication, especially when you're in the same room. You should be talking to each other, is the sentiment. Well, they are, but not in the way she wants. So how do I think about this? Well, Dana Boyd was discussing social media, especially social networking sites, and she had an interesting choice of words. It was not saying that these sites did new things, but they had the power to amplify. So she said, well, you know, people gossiped about each other in class before now, you know, who you're going out with, or, oh, they said that about you behind your back and whatever, a whole load of things. It's not new for people to fall out about it. So they're not new practices, but when you can send the message to 1,000 people rather than talk to one individually, or when someone can instant reply, all these social dramas can be amplified. And I was thinking maybe that's the way to think about communication here. Not that new things are happening, but the smartphone has the ability to amplify communication, and it does so in good ways in the eyes of children, and the very same things could be bad ways in the eyes of children, which is why I chose the words for better or for worse. It amplifies for good and for bad. Yeah? Sometimes the very same thing that I like about it is looked at another way, the thing that I don't like about it. Okay, the last theme I'm going to look at is this privatisation of internet access. Let's go back to the mobile phone before the smartphone to put this in perspective. This big discussion lasts at least 15 years old now, about what the mobile phone is doing new when children have it is they can communicate when their parents can't see. So it's the unsupervised aspect. Now, communicate here meant actually, you know, talk. And this did mean something. I remember years ago interviewing parents, and they didn't, this was before smartphones, didn't even want cordless phones, because when you had the cord phone, the attached one, you could sort of listen in to who the children were talking to and get some idea, the equivalent of glancing at the internet on the computer screen. And when you had devices that you could use when parents, even if that was in your own room, then that led to a discussion of, well, from the children's perspective, that's more privacy, and from the parents' perspective, that's less able to monitor. And then this discussion came along about the internet access in private spaces. Once it moved from a public space like the living room into a private space like the bedroom, same issue, but applied to the internet. And a continuation of this is with smartphones. And especially, there's a theme that came from the mobile phone literature, which is very much how children, and adults actually, but children were attached to mobile phones in a way they weren't attached to PCs. They were far more personal. They evoked far more emotions, for example. And this has implications, for instance, for checking histories. When you have to hand over your smartphone and your parents want to check, it's not even quite the same as someone checking the history on your PC, because having to hand over this very personal device. This is one of the sub-themes that came out, even when I was looking at the EU Kids online qualitative data. I'm not feeling very comfortable about this, handing over my smartphone to my parents, even though I felt obliged to do it. So what does all this mean from the child's perspective? Well, elsewhere I've got an article in the process of going through to publication, which is very much looks at as children get older, their desire for more personal space and privacy from parents, and hence the appeal, it is argued, of spaces where parents are absent, And recently, the discussion, for instance, of when parents were not on Facebook, it's an attractive place to go to. As parents go onto Facebook more and more, children want to go somewhere else, yeah, to have privacy from parents. So some migration away from Facebook because of that reason. And if you like, you can say smartphones for those various reasons, for you not being around when you're seeing they're used, and that, you know, just that little bit harder to check, various reasons, are contributing to more privacy. From the parent's point of view, it's undermining some strategies. Physical monitoring, looking at what they're doing, glancing over is less easy. I've mentioned the checking business. Interestingly enough, I was looking at the EU Kids Online data before this current project. This was some of the statistics. And if you looked at this was 2010. So at that stage, any children getting mobile phones were actually early adopters compared to now. And if you look at their parents were the ones who used these monitoring strategies less. Yeah? An interesting question of, were they forced to do so because the children had smartphone and they couldn't? But I suspect it might be the other way around, that they're the type of parents who are more trusting of their children, so it was no big issue in a sense to hand over the smartphone. You were not using the strategy you used to use before. When you look at the current data, interestingly, parents are less likely to use various controls, you know, filters, limits in contracts, software, etc., on smartphones compared to the internet. So it's a type of device which is, again, less controlled. And parents are less likely to know what children do on their smartphones compared to the internet in generally. So that's what the quantitative stuff is telling us, reinforcing children having some more privacy. So here's some examples. There's some parents here, 14 to 16-year-olds. They're talking about, you know, looking at their children's smartphones. So Sarah says, I'm not even allowed to touch it. And Mother Lisa says, yes, they would go completely ballistic if I tried to. And then Sarah says, no, she won't even let me hold it. When she showed me a photograph, you know, she's saying, I need to hold it. She can't let go of it in case I see something. So this conveying the sense of, you know, would be a bit tricky to check histories of children like this with their mobile phones. Or Irene. It's more difficult to control somehow something that they have in their pockets. You have to ask them, hand me your mobile phone so I can know what you're doing. It's a breach of and Caesar volunteers' privacy. And Irene recognises this, privacy of kids. When they're at the computer, it's easy to peek and to see what they're looking at by searching the browser history records. And as the devices get smaller, it's more and more difficult to know what they're doing, as was captured in the statistics. Right, I tend to be a bit careful about claiming ICTs had this effect. You know, I come from a tradition where technological determinism is frowned upon. So I hesitate, and I must say there are examples, plenty of them, where however difficult it was, parents demanded to see their children's smartphones even when their children were quite old, even if it led to conflicts. And you have a variety of parental advice which says, for instance, you should use filters and limitations and a whole range of strategies. On the other hand, it's a mixed picture out there. Especially I was looking at some recent psychological research on parental mediation, which is stressing, you know, it's quite good to be sensitive to the views of the child. And you think, oh, you know, this is, I think, slowly filtering into policy recommendations as well. And they've got these background claims within our area of sociology about the detraditionalisation of the family. That you can't say children are being treated equally, but at least they're being acknowledged more than, say, decades and decades ago, with more negotiation, more taking into account their rights. So if I think the smartphone is doing anything here, and there's certain suggestions that it may be in this evidence, it's against this background of other factors. Yeah? It's not there on its own. It's taking place about a complex set of discourses about what parents should be doing. And, you know, when I go to meetings and do my presentations, there's a certain uncertainty when parents in the audience then ask me what I think they should be doing. So things are up for grabs here. Okay, to summarise, conclusions. The first was about these periodic claims that is this a special generation? And basically, I'm trying to put this into perspective, especially for emphasising constraints. In the second one, I was looking at communication and its potential to amplify, to enhance, but it does so in different directions, sometimes simultaneously. You know, what's interesting, I should add, is of course some of these things I raised about tempting and being distracted and was this communication necessary, the children are talking like adults talk. You know, not the same themes. They're not particularly children's issues. They're people's issues, but they happen to apply to children. And also quite interested, you know, I didn't talk about so much about risk today because I had far more material discussing communications issues. It's something that they were, it was an issue for them. They could recite all they'd been told in their e-safety lessons about risks and so on, but when they got agitated and wanting to talk, sometimes it's around these issues that's important. And the last one on parental mediation, you often ask, look for all the statistics and say, well, what, to see the wood for the trees argument, what difference is the smartphone or may the smartphone be making? And I just thought this issue of privatisation and the implications for parental mediation might be a good candidate for what is happening that could be big and slightly different. But as long as you take into account it's against these backdrop of other things. And to put another way, these are the three things that I hope I've covered. That's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. That was great for me anyway, because it confirmed a lot of what I thought already, so that's good for me. Any questions from the audience? Now's your chance, because I have some half-baked ones. Anyone want to go first? No, nothing? Well, I just have to check. Well, my first question was that in your Q&A, you mentioned the comparison between the way that parents act in Denmark and in the UK. And I don't want to sound all kind of parental section in the Weekend Guardian, whatever, but is there any kind of advice on how you think it was? Do you remember what I'm...
Yeah. Actually, the point I made in the Q&A was about schools, about the rules difference.
Sorry, it wasn't about
it was about schools. I mean, there are actually some clues that parents might be acting a bit differently in Denmark as well. That was picked out by one of our other co-authors. But the school's point of view is when we were looking at statistics about are you allowed to use here, are there restrictions, can you use Wi-Fi? Most of the countries, there were heavy restrictions on children, but not so much in Denmark. In fact, a lot of children says, well, you know, we can bring them to school, we can bring them to school when we're young. We could even use the school Wi-Fi with our smartphone, which would be, you know, a no-no for most schools here. And I thought that was interesting because it just reminds you it's not automatic how smartphones are perceived. In one culture, in our culture, the teachers are, I know, worried about them being disruptive. So when I asked in the UK, the junior school teachers, I said, well, I can understand the lessons. Why don't you like them using it in playtime, for example? Oh, no, they should be talking to each other. They should be playing in playtime. They shouldn't be, it's making them antisocial. So there was this, you know, non-educational, but nevertheless agenda of why we didn't want phones in schools. But clearly that's not necessarily perceptions of the Danish, their institutions, that it was something to worry about.
So do you think the Danish might have a point? And like, you might not want me to push you into any direction, but do you think that we could maybe be a bit more loose?
I think we could, because, I mean, what happens as far as I can see here, when I was asking about schools, I said, well, how do you make your decisions? And really, it's very devolved here, you know. In fact, to be specific, it's usually the head teacher who makes a decision about policy and then came and announced it to all the other teachers. But it wasn't as if there was there's a place to consult necessarily about what schools should be doing, or if there is, it doesn't seem to be being used very much. It's like there's no wider discussion. It's left to more individual decisions, and those seem to be going in the direction of a very conservative view. Especially, it's picked out that a lot of teachers saw no educational merit in smartphones because they associated them with entertainment and communication, social communication. Yeah. And yet, for instance, it was picked up by some of the interviews in some countries. People are actually using their smartphones secretly in class to check on what the teacher was saying, for example. Yeah?
Okay, in that case, you teach here at the LSE as well, right, as I mentioned. So what do you say to your students who are also, but they're students and they bring their smartphones, laptops and tablets and so on? Do you have any rules, as some teachers we know at the LSE?
I talk about all this to them as an example, and say and ask them to think about, what they're doing and what they're not doing. Not only in my lectures, in other people's lectures.
No, but in your lecture, are they allowed to have their smartphones with them? Do you have no rules at all?
I don't have any rules.
And you'd recommend it to other teachers at the LSE to also say, let them bring in the devices as they want?
I think we should have maybe a discussion about this, rather than me making unilateral recommendations about other people's courses. I don't make a big thing about it.
Okay. Any of the teachers want to say anything about any other questions from anyone? Yeah, go on.
I had a question. It's just about, you're specifically talking about smartphones, and obviously the difference between smartphone and mobile phone is the availability of the internet. I know you didn't want to be technologically determined, but do you think that is the tipping point for all of these perhaps social changes? Or do you think...
Could you clarify a little bit more?
Well, you're suggesting that there are some changes in social relations as a result of smartphone use, but you're also saying that maybe it's just perhaps the next thing in the next technology coming along, and if we look to the past, maybe there haven't been the changes that people expected. So I'm just wondering if there is something different about the smartphone, and I'm suggesting maybe that might be that the smartphone is opening the door to a much bigger world than any of the other previous technologies have.
No, I would hesitate to say that. If I was going to put emphasis on anything, it would be the internet in general rather than the smartphone in particular, as opening new possibilities. Everything that comes along has some ramifications or consequences. The question is always a decision, and how big are those? If we're talking about lots of little things, I mean, there's loads of things that have changed in my life due to various technology and various aspects of the internet. But where do I place them on really serious or empowering changes, or something I would say was very, very dramatic? I'm still of the view that maybe the smartphone does interesting things, but I would hesitate to put it on a pedestal and say this is the one that makes the big difference compared to other things that have gone before.
Any others? Otherwise, I have one more. This is the half-baked one. It's just kind of when you were talking about the children and their negative and positive comments. I generally, personally, tend to focus on the negative ones, find them more interesting, possibly because that's the way I am. But is there anything about children being possibly more positive when you ask them about that than they might be once they're proper grown-ups, like me? Do you know what I'm trying to say? Does anybody know what I'm trying to say? It's just like in interviews, do they tend to be a bit more positive until you question, but what are the really, the negative? Like, I find the negative so much more convincing about the way that it's intrusive, about the peer pressure, and yet they seem to say, but I like it, don't take it away from me.
Yeah,
do you see what I mean?
There's one. Let me explain how these interviews worked. These post-it stickers, and they're supposed to give them out, and they're supposed to write down things I find positive and things I find negative about smartphones and tablets. And then that's a basis for discussion later on, so I'll come back to that. I must admit I was following up their negatives a bit more, but they instantly generated long lists, and I would say some of the negatives were longer than the positives, and yet in conversation they could talk about everything, and the overall evaluation was I'm quite positive about smartphones, but here's the problems.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's kind of what I expect. I know that's what I would say as well. Of course, I don't want to give it up, but, you know, like, yes, it intrudes into my life and so on, so that was...
I think in general, I'm not thinking of children, I'm thinking of interviews with adults as well. When you ask them to think about things, if they want to find something to develop and talk about, it's often something that's irritated them or
Yes.
they complain about, they'd like to see this better. And it's true that even if they have an overall positive evaluation, sometimes they can easily list the negative things. And then the interview said, oh, but don't get misled by the interview. I've been talking for ages about all the bad things. I really do like it.
So really what comes out then, what comes through is that there's almost no difference at all between what you know about the children and their use, for better or for worse, of smartphones and tablets and adults. I mean, it sounds...
No, they're in many respects...
Other than the constraints. I mean...
Yeah. It's when something they're doing relates to perceptions of what children should or should not be doing, especially by parents, by other adults. And that comes through... Actually, that comes through everywhere, because it came through in some of the constraints that are to do with them being children, some of them, and some of the communication issues. You know, you should be socialising now because this is a developmental point in your life. So now is the really, really, really important time to develop social skills, for example, which you wouldn't necessarily argue with an adult. And of course, some of these things about the privatisation, it's because it's parental mediation which is being, let's say, challenged.
Okay, okay, one last question to you as an audience then. I'm not a parent, so it was the privatization I thought was really quite interesting as well. And do any of you who are parents did you find that not very intrusive? I mean, is this a normal thing that you check your children's internet history? Is that normal? Is that what you do? Would you have done it without the internet into their diaries? And I mean, I find my smartphone also so personal, I won't let it go. You know, you can have a look at this picture, but you're not touching. Is that, do you want to?
It's really tricky. I mean, my daughter's really... It's really tricky, but my daughter's really young. She's only 3, and I'm already worrying about when she's a teenager and how I'm going to monitor the Facebook. When will I allow her to use it? You know, I'm already thinking of it because she's so advanced. She'll put the pin in my phone. She'll know how to find YouTube. She'll find her Play-Doh videos. And I'm thinking I was not like that when I was her age. So, but yeah, it's been really interesting. But I think I probably would be one of the parents that says, hand over your phone. If I'm worried from now, I think that's going to be me.
Yeah, no, I just do random spot checks. So it's literally give me your phone and I check it there and then in front of them.
And am I allowed to ask how old they are?
Yeah, I've got 13 and 11-year-old.
Okay, so that's quite normal that you just have to check it because it's something so huge that intrudes into...
Once in a couple of months. Because they never know when it's coming. I think they're quite sensible with their devices.
Okay. Do you want to say anything? Because you
No,
obviously talked
a lot, you know,
about
to be quite honest, this was less of an issue for especially younger children like 9, 10, but some 11, 12, 13 were not so. 12, 13 starting to get a bit iffy, 14, 15, 16, even the parents are saying, maybe I'm going to stop checking by the time they get that old because, or some of the parents said, I'm tired of having a fight over this. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, you'll find out in a few years.
Check it less as they get older, but you know, she's new to secondary school and
Yeah.
we're getting involved with boys and yeah, just next month see what she's up to.
Okay, one last comment. Do you want to? 'Cause I know you have a children.
Yeah, I mean, my thought is not really as a parent, but it's sort of an extension of that thing about privacy. What I thought was interesting was whether you, or kind of the question that came to me was, I thought the whole thing about the private personal space that smartphone use provided, whether you saw any relation to kind of limits of the privacy in outside spaces and changes in children's use of physical space.
Well, there's a wider argument that was related to social media, and this was raised in the US, but maybe equally well true in other countries like the UK, is that places there were more physical spaces where children could hang out in an unsupervised way, like shopping malls, and they're being forced out of those physical spaces into people to come tell them to move on. And there was an argument interesting that part of the appeal of places like social networking sites is they were alternative places to hang out when you'd been moved out of physical spaces. I find it's an interesting argument, and there may be something in it.
Okay, I think I can't get any more out of you. So, thank you very much for coming. Thank you so much again to Leslie for your talk. So, thank you. And I think the last thing that I have to do, and I haven't even prepared for, is to advertise next NetworkED. It's Sonia Livingston. I do not know when. Oh, yes, I do. The next speaker for 2015, on the 25th of February in 2015, is Sonia Livingston, who's sitting here in the audience. Again, LSE Media and Communications Department, and we'll be discussing her research of kids, EU kids online. Hope to see you there. Thank you very much. Bye.